If you usually don't write tests to your code, think about this. Tests are not meant for today, but they're meant for tomorrow. And the reason is quite simple. Every time you write some code and you ship it to the client, to the customer, that code will not just run today. It will run for weeks, months, and years ahead. So spending a little bit more time right now, today, when you write your code the first time, will actually save you a lot of time in the future. In today's video, we're gonna see together why tests are so important, and in the second part of the video, I'm gonna tell you some of the drawbacks. Because, like everything, it depends. First of all, writing tests helps you finding bugs early. It's obvious, right? You write unit tests, you write some edge cases, and automatically you will see if some tests are red. But this is pretty much the same as launching your app, testing it in the browser, so why not just write tests in the first place? Tests that are doing exactly what you're doing from the browser, or at least simulating some of your actions, will not only make sure your code works today, but will prevent you from having bugs in the future. Well-written tests are also living documentation. If you're new to the project and you go on the test file, you can see in plain English what some part of the codes are supposed to do, and you can see the exact code that gets executed in order to accomplish what the test was describing. So it's exactly documentation of what that part of code is doing. You can also add in the test all the edge cases so that if someone else new reads your code, it's also able to quickly see what it's supposed to expect in order of weird inputs or outputs of your application. One more huge advantage is being more confident in writing and editing your code in the future. Your code or the code someone else written. Yes, that's because if there's a complicated logic that is not tested and you need to add a little bit here and there or do some changes, you're always afraid that the code will no longer do what it was supposed to do. In large code bases, it's super common that you just do a little fix or a little change and something else breaks somewhere else. And if you have your code properly tested, you immediately notice that your little change broke a couple of tests so that you can fix them right before shipping your code. You might say that writing tests takes time, and it's true. Writing tests is in fact time that you're taking away from writing new features. But hear this. Imagine that you wrote your code without testing. You ship it to your customer, and after a few days, your customer comes back with a bug. First of all, what if your bug is actually causing your client to lose money? You save some time in not writing the test, but now your customer is losing money, and he's not gonna be happy about that. Even if the customer is not losing money, you still have a lot of pressure because you have to fix that bug as soon as possible. So if you were doing something else, you have to context switch, maybe change branch, open a new hotfix from main, from production, and you have to start working on that specific thing. And it might take some time to fix the bug, then you have again to run your pipelines, you have to go through all the deployment process, you have to ship your code again, and the client can test if the bug is fixed. So isn't that a waste of time? I mean, what if you had something to prevent the code from breaking in first place, like writing unit tests? But you might say that writing tests sometimes is hard. The code has a lot of dependencies, it's complicated, but isn't this a red flag? I mean, if your code has a lot of dependencies, so many that you cannot test it properly, maybe you should better structure your code. The key takeaway here is that if you write code that is easy to test, is probably automatically also better code. Because if you're able to separate every concept separated in your code, all the logics are living on their own so that you can test them atomically, well, maybe this also means that your code is better structured. And what was the advantage here? You wrote your code having in mind that you had to test it, and now automatically your code is much more readable and better and more future-proof. For example, if you're having some hard times testing a React component, maybe you should look where the logic is and you can create a hook which encapsulates some part of the logic so that you can test the hook. Maybe you have some logic that is tightly coupled into the JSX part. Well, Maybe you can create separate functions. Maybe you can extract some code, you can create smaller components which encapsulate smaller parts of the logic. And by doing that, by forcing yourself to test that specific component, you actually improve the quality of that component itself. And now you also have tests making sure your code is doing what it's supposed to do. And now, after saying some of the biggest advantages in writing tests, let's also go on the downsides, because yes, actually there are downsides in writing tests, and let me tell you some of them. First of all, tests might give you a false sense of security. The thing is, a couple of minutes ago I said that tests are giving you more confidence, which is absolutely a good thing. But if tests are not done properly, you might think that you change some code, tests are still green, so you have no bugs at all. But this cannot be true by any means. Even though you think your code is properly tested, whenever you do a change, tests are still passing. Please be careful and double check what you wrote, because even if tests are green, it doesn't mean that bugs are not there. One more reason of criticism to tests is about their maintainability. Yes, that's because if you have a lot of tests in your code base and some part of your code are frequently changed, this also means you have to frequently change and keep up to date your test. You might think that this is a waste of time, and for sure this is an extra load of time you need to write your code, but what if you consider the test as actually part of the code? You change the code, you also change the test. Does it make sense to you? One more downside is on continuous integration. Tests are actually taking time to execute, which means also longer builds. Sure, you can take optimizations such as running tests in parallel, having better hardware, but they will always take a little bit extra time in your builds. This is also bad in case of flaky tests. There are those tests that sometimes fail, sometimes not, and are driving you crazy. So if you have that kind of test, make sure to fix them as soon as possible. And the reason is quite simple. Every time you have some builds that are failing because of some randomly failing test, you have to re-execute them, you have to context switch and think about that thing, so fix them as soon as possible. The last downside we're gonna see today is code coverage. I basically dedicated an entire video about that, and you can find it on my channel. Here the thing is that code coverage is a really great tool, but it's about you if you're able to use it properly. If you only focus on code coverage, then you're probably doing it wrong. Coverage helps you finding which parts of the code are not properly tested, but it should never be your end goal. Having a code that is 99% covered in tests doesn't mean anything at all. It means that you have some tests that are scanning through all lines, but what if your tests are not actually testing to the right input? Or what if edge cases are not covered? Focusing too much on code coverage might lead to bad tests, and that is exactly a waste of time. Someone might prevent pull requests to be merged if code coverage is below a threshold, which might be a good indicator, but stopping an entire pull request because the code is not covered enough, I don't know. Coverage is a really helpful tool if you want to see which parts of the code needs more testing, but it should never be your number one goal, because for sure it will lead you into wrong decisions. For example, wasting time in tests that are not actually giving strength to the project, but just for the sake of code coverage you're writing some extra code that, like I said, needs to be maintained, and it's actually doing nothing at all other than keeping that number higher. And this was my personal take on why tests are so important in software developer. What do you think? I will be really happy to hear about your opinion. With that said, thanks for watching and see you in the next video.